Trust the Profits Breeders' Cup coverage is brought to you by PlayUp Racebook, the most horse player-friendly racebook in the industry. PlayUp Racebook is always your best bet.
He might own the turf at Belmont, but we're going to see if he can own the turf at Keeneland. We're going to do a barn tour of Chad Brown for the Breeders' Cup. Salutations and welcome, friends. I'm your host, Matthew Desantis, for this episode of Countdown to Keeneland. You can, of course, find me on Twitter at the handle @FailedToMenace. And this has been a great last couple of weeks as I've been doing these barn tours. This is going to be the final barn tour that we're going to be posting because we're going to get into Breeders' Cup next week. And there's going to be a lot of specific Breeders' Cup coverage that we have on Trust the Profits. So you want to make sure to like, subscribe, follow, get those notifications whenever we push out new videos, new content, because we're going to be jam-packed with content next week, from picks and previews to breaking down races to having on guests from all across the world, actually, to give us insight into the horses that are running. So you really don't want to miss it. We have so much great stuff, whether it's myself, whether it's El Hombre, whether it's Colin, whether it's Formulator. We got a lot of people doing a lot of great things here on the channel this next week. So make sure to like and subscribe. Make sure to follow me on Twitter. This is the best way to get all of the content all of the time. But like I said, this is the final barn tour. We've done a bunch of them. So we've done Charlie Appleby. We did Aidan O'Brien. We did Bob Baffert. We did Steve Asmussen. We did Todd Pletcher. Brad Cox as well. Now we're going to finish up with Chad Brown today. And this is kind of the final of the really big trainers that are bringing large contingents over. But before we get into the barn tour, just want to remind everyone to check out our sponsor, PlayUp Racebook. If you go and sign up at PlayUp Racebook today, you will receive a 50% deposit bonus for up to $250. Additionally, for the Breeders' Cup, they're running this campaign for the next week. If you deposit $100 or more before the Breeders' Cup, they will give you an additional $25 free wager. I just watched Flightline's 5 furlong workout at Keeneland this morning. I don't know if I'm going to put a $25 wager on that classic race. I know Colin's going to bet on Epicenter, but there's a lot of other races. There are 13 other races where I think you might be able to find some prices. I'm very much so team Flightline, but we'll see. Hey, that's why they got to run the races, right? Who's it? Steve Asmussen said, words like always and never don't belong in horse racing. It's the absolute truth. The most, immortal of locks will sometimes fall apart, and you never know what ends up happening. So that's why they run the races. But like I said, make sure to go check out PlayUp Racebook. They've been a great help to us, great sponsor. We really appreciate their support of Trust the Profits. But like I said, we're going to dive into Chad Brown today, and he actually has the largest barn in terms of contingent that's coming to the Breeders' Cup. And by a pretty significant margin, actually. He's bringing 13 horses this year. And obviously Brown's meteoric rise in horse racing is something that, I don't want to say it's unprecedented, but it has come so quick to him. I mean, the success has been immediate, starting in 2008, really, like I said, just kind of happening overnight. And he's racked up so much success in big races on big days. Obviously, he's very well known on the East Coast, and he has this fleet of very impressive turf horses. He's got some very strong owners with Peter Brand, with Klarovich. He's got great connections overseas as well in terms of bringing horses over from Europe and then taking them into his barn and running them here in the United States. He's had a lot of success. A lot of the horses that we're actually going to look at on turf started in Europe and now are over here running for Brown. But the thing about Chad Brown that I think impresses me is that he's become a big name in the dirt industry as well. And I think when you look at his barn, it's much more balanced than I think people sometimes at first blush assume, because they just go Chad Brown, turf, that's what it is. It's a lot more complicated than that, and it's a lot deeper than that. So let's do a deep dive into Brown's barn. And if you take a look at his Breeders' Cup record, you realize that just in a very short period of time, he has had an incredible amount of success. He only brought his first horse to the Breeders' Cup in 2007. So all of these 116 starts have happened over the last 14 years. as opposed to somebody like Steve Asmussen, who's been around the game forever, only has 60 starts at the Breeders' Cup. Somebody like Todd Pletcher, obviously, who's been around for a long time, has about 150. Bob Baffert only has 100. So Chad Brown, in a very short period of time, has racked up an incredible amount of starts at the Breeders' Cup. Of course, a lot of victories as well. 15 wins, 12 places, 13 shows. Miram was the first of his winners in 2008. But you look at horses like Lady Eli, Bobby's Kitten. I know, shout out to my man Barry Spears, who I think hit the pick 5 that day with Bobby's Kitten. Won quite a good chunk of change, if I'm not mistaken. He was just reminiscing about that with me the other day. Good Magic, Sister Charlie, Bricks and Mortar. I mean, these are all horses that were just so impressive in winning, and are great Brown horses that just built his legacy, winning at about a 14% clip, which is actually pretty comparable to what you see with Asmussen and Baffert. Really, Todd Pletcher is the American trainer that, the big name American trainer that has experienced less success. I mean, we talked about this. Pletcher brings a lot of horses, more than anybody else. He doesn't win at nearly as high of a rate. He only wins at about an 8% clip. Brown, Asmussen, Baffert, all winning in around that 14, 15, 16% clip. Just something for you to think about and consider when you're looking at handicapping the card. And of course, Brad Cox, maybe a little bit like Chad Brown 10 years ago, kind of burst onto the scene, has had a lot of success. He's only had about 26 starters at the Breeders' Cup, but has won 31% of those races. So again, just something to consider when taking all of this in and handicapping. But let's take a look at Brown's 13 horse fleet this year. And what you can tell here is, yes, there's a lot of turf, but there's also a lot of dirt involved. And so we'll just cap it off at the top here. You see a couple of horses, particularly Pipeline and Virginia Joy, both of whom are listed in 2 different divisions. We'll see where they end up going. Virginia Joy currently listed in both the turf and the filly and mare turf. I think the filly and mare turf is probably more feasible for her. But Brown has obviously a fair amount of horses in that race with Rozier and Italian. Maybe one doesn't want to have all 3 of them in that one spot. Maybe wants to run Virginia Joy in the turf separate from the others. So that's certainly something to consider when you have a barn as large as Brown's. Then you have Search Results. This is a very interesting horse. I can't tell you how impressed I was with Search Results in that Ogden Phipps, which was a 3rd place finish, but she and Latruska just went out so fast, and it was just so incredibly impressive that Search Results held on. Finished second to Malathat at the Personal Ensign last time out. Search Results is a very intriguing horse that is going to, in some ways, hold the key to that distaff race, and we'll talk more about that in a second. Of course, Virginia Joy, I shouldn't have glossed over. Last time out, won the Grade 1 Flower Bowl and beat Warlike Goddess. Now, a lot of people could say Warlike Goddess had not a very good trip that day. A lot of people would point fingers at Joel Rosario for that. Warlike Goddess certainly did not look comfortable that entire time, was just in traffic and covered up, and it just was not a good race for her. But nevertheless, Virginia Joy got to the finish line first, and that's what matters. So then, you look down the list, the next horse that probably actually draws more attention than anybody else in Brown's barn is Domestic Spending, because Domestic Spending last ran in 2021, finishing second at the Mr. D Grade 1 at Arlington Park. Pour one out for Arlington Park. And Domestic Spending is coming back from a 16-month layoff and is going straight into running in the Breeders' Cup Mile. This is stunning. Now, Brown has said this horse has been training lights out. I get it. This is still going to be a tall task for Domestic Spending to do, but he was kind of the preeminent turf horse in America before that long layoff. So perhaps can regain some of this. Then you look at a horse like Regal Glory, also going to the mile, finished second in the First Lady last time out. Regal Glory's a horse that I really like. She's run well, I think, over the last few times, and has actually never finished out of the exacta, if I'm not mistaken, in the last 8 races. I mean, so she's been incredibly consistent. Again, this mile field is very loaded, very stacked, but another great horse there. Then you have Pipeline and Jack Christopher. Now, we're going to see if Pipeline ends up going to the sprint or the dirt mile, but it's interesting. Pipeline, much like Search Results, may hold the key to that sprint if Pipeline runs in the sprint. Jack Christopher, of course, is the prodigious was a prodigious 2-year-old winning the Champagne in impressive fashion, then having that shin surgery, coming back as a 3-year-old. Of course, the experiment of trying to stretch out to 2 turns and finishing third at the Haskell, which by the way, like was not a bad finish. Like most traders would take that in a heartbeat, finishing third at the Haskell. But they've decided Jack Christopher is ultimately a sprint horse. This is what he is. He's a 1-turn horse, and he's a great 1-turn horse. And so it's going to be fun to see him run against the older sprint horses, particularly Jackie's Warrior, in that spot. Then Cox has just such a good group of female turf horses. And so you see Rozier and In Italian there in that filly and mare sprint. Rozier, I'll talk a little bit more about that EP Taylor grade 1 win last time out at Woodbine. That was a really fascinating race and may speak to the lack of quality competition in that race. But I was so impressed by what Rozier did that day. That was a rough trip she had. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more. But that's a horse that may be on the bounce back a little bit after some rough stretches in 2022. In Italian, of course, setting the track record, setting the stakes record, I should say, up at Saratoga in the Diana, and has been a little bit of a revelation. I mean, in some ways was overshadowed by some of the other horses in Brown's barn, I should say. And has just developed this front running style of just going out front and just saying, all right, like, let's see if anybody can keep up with me. And the answer is usually no. And one of the few horses that will actually push a pace in a New York turf race, which is breaking news whenever that happens. And so In Italian's a horse, I'll be honest, I've faded for most of this year, and I've been wrong most of this year on this horse. This is a horse I've been kind of slow to come around on. Annapolis was another horse I was a little slow to come around on. I'm not sure the race shape sets up in the filly and mare turf for In Italian, but nevertheless, this is just such a good horse, and I respect the way she rides. I respect the way she runs, and I respect Brown for, putting his horses. I mean, people make a big deal about putting these horses, he'll have 3-4 horses in a turf race, in a turf stakes race, and there's only 6 horses in the field. One thing you can't say is that they collude with each other. I mean, because they really go out and In Italian runs her race, and it's not about holding her back to let somebody else maybe get a better trip. And she goes, and if somebody can keep up with her, great. But if not, then that's on them. So she's developed a really strong running style that I think a lot of people have become quite enthralled with, and understandably so. Then you have Goodnight Olive. This is the last of the adult horses that are running in the filly mare sprint. Very fascinating horse that kind of burst onto the scene, has had some long layoffs in between during her career, but looks so good in that ballerina handicap. And that's a horse I look forward to talking a little bit more about. Definitely fits the profile of the type of horse that I like. Then we go to his juveniles. Oxymor, interesting horse. It finished second in the Now stakes last time out. I think Oxymor might be better. I think there might be distance issues with Oxymor, and we'll talk more about that from a pedigree standpoint. But I think that's a potential concern stretching out there with Oxymor. I'm Very Busy, finished second in that Pilgrim Stakes to Major Dude, and that was a little bit of a surprise. Major Dude taking to turf for the first time and winning that Pilgrim. So that was something to, certainly keep in mind. Major Dude's going to be in this race as well, but I'm Very Busy, obviously a very good horse. That was also over yielding turf that day. So sometimes those are performances that you can kind of toss out a little bit because it does look like it'll be firm turf at Keeneland. And then finally, we got Blazing Sevens, Free Look, and Raging Sea. Blazing Sevens, of course, in the juvenile, the winner of the Champagne Stakes, over slop. Again, some condition issues there in terms of, running on and off track. Now, here's the thing, though. The thing about Blazing Sevens is 2 races, the race before the Champagne ran on the slop, did not run well at all. Came back, ran well on the slop in the Champagne. So it doesn't seem like this is just a horse that is a slop horse, that just is a sealed track, is a product of a sealed track, because the horse did not like a sealed track the first time that he ran on it, and ran much better the second time. So maybe just more familiar with those, sort of off-track conditions, and was a little bit easier to take to it the second time out. But like I said, very, very good horse, winning that Champagne over Verifying in Gulfport. And then you look at Free Look. This is a horse that finished second at Pleasant Passage at the Miss Griot. Again, that was over yielding turf. That race in particular was kind of just a merry-go-round. Nobody really changed spots. So a little bit fascinating. I think conditions probably had a little bit to do with that, but certainly another talented filly for Brown's Barn. And then finally, Raging Sea finished fourth at the Alice of 80s, actually finished third and was DQ'd back to fourth because of a little bit of bumping. I like this horse a lot. This juvenile fillies field, I get more excited about every time I look at the PPs, honestly. I think this is a wide open race, and Raging Sea absolutely belongs to be in that conversation. So let's take a dive into some of these horses more specifically and individually. And so we'll get started with Virginia Joy. And one of the things that you'll notice with a few of Brown's horses, if you're looking at the PPs, and of course the ones we're looking at here from Daily Racing Form, you'll see that a lot of these horses are coming off a 2-month or more layoff. That a lot of his horses, particularly his adult horses, have not run since Saratoga in some cases, that they've run late August, early September, and they have not run since then. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Brown is notoriously fantastic off the layoff, so he knows how to get these horses ready. That's not an issue at all. In fact, even some of his former assistants like Cherie DeVoe and things like that, there's a reputation that they know how to get these horses ready off the layoff. So I'm not worried about that, but it is just interesting to note that when you're looking through the past performances, a lot of his adult horses are coming off that 2-month layoff and have not run since Saratoga. Now, they've been down at Keeneland training, so it's not as if they're just making this transition now, but just something, like I said, to keep in mind. Virginia Joy, listen, a very good horse, and ran kind of a different type of race last time out at the Flower Bowl. Had run this front running effort at the Shepherd's Bay before, and then went to the lead in the Flower Bowl as well. And, and both times won the race. Now, also, this horse has won races coming from further in the back. You see that the very one, grade 3 down at Gulfstream Park, where she sat sixth most of the way around and then made a move and ended up winning that race. But it is interesting that she has seemed to do some of her best running in some of her best spots when she gets on the lead and can set her own pace. Now, that pace last time out at the Flower Bowl was glacial. 53-second opening half. I mean, now granted, it's going a mile and 3/8, but still, that was a very, very, very slow pace that day. So, just one of the things to keep in mind with Virginia Joy, if she runs in the turf, she's going to run against some problems. I mean, there's just a higher caliber of horse in that race, quite frankly. I think Warlike Goddess, despite her beating her at the Flower Bowl, is a much better mare at this point than Virginia Joy, given the same trip, and I think given the same situation. Some of the Europeans are obviously going to be very tough to beat in this particular spot. Rebels Romance is one that comes to mind, but there's a lot of other good Europeans in this field. So it's hard to necessarily think that Virginia Joy has a good shot here. Now, if she goes to the filly and mare turf, that goes back to what we discussed earlier. Now, suddenly Brown has 3 horses in the filly and mare turf. Does he want that? Does his ownership groups want that? Does Peter Brandt want that? Things to take into consideration for sure. I mean, so it'll be interesting to see on Monday when the draws come out where Virginia Joy ends up. The fact that she's been pre-entered in both these races. Listen, she is very capable, and she is very she's an honest horse. Obviously, you can see from the PP she doesn't run many bad races, if any at all, but this is going to be a big test if she runs in the turf, I think, for her. And if she tries to go with that front running style, I don't think she'll be able to control the pace the way that she did both at the Shepherd's Bay, which was over yielding turf, and you look 54-second opening half, and then also crawling up front in a 53-second opening half at the Flower Bowl. She's not going to get those conditions in the turf or the filly and mare turf, quite frankly. So now she's going to have to come from off the lead. It doesn't seem like she does her best running from off the lead. She only has kind of she's won twice, an optional claimer and a grade 3 doing that. But against, like I said, much lesser competition, against good competition, that turn of foot just isn't elite to get her necessarily separated from everyone else. So let's talk about search results. This is a fascinating horse. So search results, like I said, that Ogden Phipps 3 back. Look at the opening quarter and half. 22 and 3 basically, and 45-1. Look at that compared to the Molly Pitcher next time out. 46 flat and 24 flat, I should say, and 47 and 2. I mean, the fact that they went almost 2 full seconds faster at the Ogden Phipps over the first half mile than they did at the Molly Pitcher should really say something. I mean, that Ogden Phipps was just incredible, where search results on Latruska went out like 15 lengths clear of Clairiere and Malafat, and that was just, I mean, just stunning to watch. And the fact that then search results dug in and like held on for like a respectable third place, didn't completely fade the way that Latruska did, was again just so incredibly impressive to be able to come back out, win that Molly Pitcher next time out, then go and run against Malafat, Clairiere, and the person Lenson, get that second place there. Again, very, very impressive horse. The reason I say search results is the key to this distaff is when you look at the pace scenario, Society is the only horse that wants the lead, okay, in that field. Search results is the next fastest horse. The question is, will search results try to replicate that Ogden Phipps, or will search results run a little bit closer to what she did at the person Lenson, where she stalks, but she's not pressing a super aggressive pace? And so that's the question that we have. If she presses Society really hard at the distaff, then it opens things up, I think, very much so for Malafat, Clairiere, and Nest. If she doesn't, if she just kind of sits, in some ways, it both is not a bad strategy for her, but it really lets things open for Society, I think. If Society can have an easy lead, that changes the dynamic in that distaff considerably. So I think search results has a huge role to play in how this distaff changes out, but a very, very talented filly for sure. So let's go to the aforementioned Domestic Spending, who is coming off an incredibly long layoff of, I think, 15 months. I said 16 earlier. I think it's 15 months from August of 2021. Actually, last ran on my sister's birthday in 2021 with Mr. D at Arlington Park. That's always sad to see AP there on the running lines now that Arlington Park is, of course, no more. But, you know, this is a horse that was, 6 for 8 winning lifetime, never finished out of the top 3, and was kind of Brown's best turf horse. I mean, you see that 106 buyer at the Manhattan, the race before the Mr. D, just such a great horse, and is now coming back and running off, a 15-month layoff. There's not a lot of analysis you can do with Domestic Spending. I mean, you can watch the works, you can, listen to Brown give interviews and talk about how impressive he is with Domestic Spending, but you just don't know. I mean, it's just such an X factor in this race. You just don't know how good Domestic Spending is going to be. And you just have to kind of wait and see. And I'm excited to see it. It's actually one of the horses, maybe one of the top 5 horses that I'm most excited to see. I mean, Flightline, obviously, I'm excited to see. Tyler's Tribe, I'm excited to see. I was seeing the little Prairie Meadows horse go up against the big boys. I'm excited to see a few other horses. I'm excited to see some of these Europeans that are coming over. But Domestic Spending, I'm excited to see what happens here, because I don't know. And anybody who claims to know, I think, is kind of selling you a bill of goods. I mean, I think that it's just such a long layoff. It's never happened with any success here at the Breeders' Cup. Even horses that come in off long layoffs typically get at least one race in beforehand. And so for Domestic Spending just to roll in off the 15-month layoff and run against the best in the world in the mile, it's going to be fascinating. I mean, we'll see what happens. And the fact they're running him at the mile, I think, is probably the right move, obviously. And, in terms of instead of the turf, which would be 1.5 miles, I think that would be obviously way too far. But it's a tough field. We talked about Modern Games a lot. We talked about a horse like Annapolis that has burst onto the scene. Talked about horses like Ivar, Order of Australia. I mean, these are all really good horses, and Domestic Spending is just going to, like I said, roll in off the bed basically and just try to see if he can beat the best horses in the world. I love it. It's a great storyline, but we're going to see if it actually works out. Then, of course, there's Regal Glory, the 6-year-old mare, who's also slated to run in the mile. And, she is kind of more of a pure miler, such an impressive career record, 12 wins in 21 races, 18 for 21 in the top 2. In the top 2. As I mentioned, she has not finished outside the exacta since June 2021. So she, yeah, I mean, she is on the podium a lot, and just a incredibly consistent horse. She did come in second to an Italian last time out at that First Lady. I think some of that is just pace. In Italian, nobody really challenged her up front, and when you do that, it's harder to close into something. I don't think that's necessarily going to be the case here at the mile. There's going to be some pace for Regal Glory to run into. Is she good enough to do it? Maybe. I mean, I think I think she's got more of a shot than I think people are probably willing to give her. I think you're going to get a pretty honest price on Regal Glory, in all honesty, because so much is going to be focused on modern games, and Annapolis, I think, to a lesser extent. And I wouldn't even be surprised if domestic spending attracts a lot of money just because people know the name. So I think Regal Glory, you're going to get a good price at. And this is a horse that, like I said, you look at those PPs, she just runs honest every single time out, and she's run against really, really good horses. I mean, that 4-star Dave was a really good race, finishing just second to Casa Creed, but beating a lot of really good horses that day. So, like I said, Regal Glory is a horse I really like a lot. She's one that I have a hard time quitting, and I've won some money with Regal Glory, but I've also lost some money the last 2 times out, actually, with this horse. But I have a feeling that she's sitting on a pretty big race here. So let's talk about another one of Chad Brown's horses that might control a lot of a race, and that's Pipeline. Pipeline really, in many ways, made the forego last time out, pressing Jackie's Warrior and setting that up for Cody's Wish to some extent to come from the back and pass Jackie's Warrior and Pipeline down the stretch. Pipeline, of course, ran very well, though, in that race. Finished third in a Grade 1. Previously, his only other attempt at a Grade 1 was at a mile at the Cigar Mile, finished a very distant 8th. But that, of course, that sent him to the bench for a while, so you think something probably went wrong in that race. That race is a bit of an outlier when you look at the rest of his running form. Is Pipeline good enough to finish in the top 3 in either the sprint or the mile? It seems very unlikely. But if he's running in the sprint, then he again controls some things, because the question is, would he go out and press Jackie's Warrior? And I ask that because, of course, the next horse that we're going to talk about, Jack Christopher, also in Chad Brown's barn, is also running in that race. And if you have Pipeline, soften up Jackie's Warrior, who's the beneficiary, probably Jack Christopher. And so Pipeline, again, controls some of this race by just how aggressively, if he runs in the sprint, how aggressively he goes after Jackie's Warrior. Because otherwise, we talked about this on one of my pre-entry reaction videos, there's not a ton of early speed in that Breeders' Cup sprint. I mean, that seems antithetical to say. There's not a ton of front speed. That Jackie's Warrior is kind of the lone speed outside of Pipeline. That Pipeline's really the only other horse that wants to press the issue potentially. Jack Christopher, everybody knows, wants to sit and stalk. He doesn't want to press. He wants to stalk. And so I now at 6 furlongs, maybe you go Jack Christopher is going to be more aggressive at 6 furlongs because he can do the distance. He can do 7 furlongs or a mile. And so he can go a little harder, a little faster, a little sooner at 6 furlongs. Maybe you think that's the case, but Pipeline, like I said, I think controls a lot of things here for that particular race shape setup. Well, then there's Jack Christopher. And I'll be honest with you, from an emotional standpoint, Simplification is my favorite 3-year-old in the country. Don't ask me to explain why. It's hard for me to explain why. I can't even articulate it sometimes, but I just love that horse. Outside of Simplification, Jack Christopher is my absolute favorite 3-year-old and one of my favorite horses, full stop. I love this horse. I've loved this horse since he broke his maiden last year in Saratoga. I have been on the Jack Christopher train since day one. This horse is just so impressive. I'm thrilled that they took a shot at the Haskell. It didn't work. And I'm thrilled that Chad said, listen, let's just go back to sprinting. We're not going to try to prolong this 2-turn experiment. We're not going to try to, get a grade 3 at a mile and an 1/8 or a mile and a 16th somewhere. This is a sprint horse. So let's make him a sprint horse and let's make him an elite sprint horse. Takes him right back to the 8 Challenge Jerkins. And that was that was a good turnaround. That was, granted it was a month afterwards, but that was the, Jack Christopher went from running 7 furlongs to a mile and an 1/8, and then, goes back to 7 furlongs a month later. And that was a good race with Goodnight underneath. And, but again, just really good horse. I just really love Jack Christopher so much. But you see in those running lines, wants to sit second. I mean, wants to ultimately have a horse to run at. Now, maybe you go, Jack Christopher is just going to, get everybody to clear out. And he's going to take sight at Jackie's Warrior and just kind of sit off Jackie's Warrior and say, okay, well, I'm just going to wait and then I'm going to go. I'm very high on Jack Christopher in this spot. I think Jack Christopher is just that good of a horse. I think if there's a little bit of pressure on Jackie's Warrior, that it really does open things up. And I know some people think Jack Christopher should go to the Breeders' Cup Mile. And I think at the Dirt Mile, he probably romps. I don't think it's particularly close if he decides to run a mile. It is a 2-turn mile, which is a little bit of a different dynamic. But man alive, I think Jack Christopher is going to be a horse that's going to be just tough to beat. And I understand why he went to the sprint, because quite frankly, the pot at the sprint is bigger than the pot at the Dirt Mile. And so the payouts are bigger and better. So Jack Christopher going to this sprint. I'm excited to see him running against Jackie's Warrior. I'm excited about this future sprint class because there's some nice 3-year-olds. You have Jack Christopher, you have Gunite, you have Running Son of a Gun. You have a few horses that are these 3-year-old sprinters that are really going to turn into, I think, some nice adult sprinters. I look forward to having these horses around for a little while. That's the one thing I love about, Jack Christopher is there's not a ton of money in stud fees there's money, don't get me wrong, for stud fees and siring fees for sprint horses, but you hope to see Jack Christopher come back and run a little bit more often because their careers end up stretching out a little bit longer. You're not quite as eager to always get them to the siring barn as quickly. So Jack Christopher, the huge shot, I think, here in the Breeders' Cup Sprint. Well, so then we got Rozier, and we also have an Italian in the filly and mare turf. And Rozier is a horse that came over, made a lot of, I think, headlines in the Begay, and won that North American debut. And then, kind of had some issues, ran into New York, ran into Diana, ran into Beverly D, didn't particularly run well in any of them. Didn't run terribly, but just, those were small fields and finished close to the back in all 3 of them. Then goes up to Woodbine, runs in the EP Taylor, and this was a bizarre race. If you have not watched the replay of this, do it. Because going around the 3rd and 4th turn, Rozier completely has to check up. Looks like she's actually being pulled up at one point, and I almost think she's stopping and dropping out of the race. She then restarts and gets going again and ends up winning the race. And just, it was a really bizarre trip to see. It was a very unusual. You rarely see a horse get taken up going around the 3rd and 4th turn the way that she did, and then be able to restart and go again. That's one of the things. I mean, I've ridden some horses in my life. I can't say I've ever ridden race horses, but I've ridden enough horses in my life to know that if you give them multiple signals, they get confused a lot of times. And they're like, well, do you want me to stop or you want me to go? Like, what do you want me to do? And so when a horse, like I said, gets given multiple signals, gets taken up and then says, let's keep going, not all horses respond well to that. The fact that Rozier came back and won that race was really impressive. Might also speak to the caliber of competition she was running against up there, but still, it's grade 1 at Woodbine. That was a good race. But I just think she's a cup below some of these other filly and mares that are going to be in the spot. But the fact that Rozier is like an afterthought just speaks how deep this particular division is and how deep Brown's Barn is as well. So Horsehead is most definitely not an afterthought, is of course an Italian. We've talked about an Italian quite a bit already, but I'll just say that front running style, I don't know if she'll be able to get away with it here. There's a couple of other horses that I think are just better. And there's a couple of horses who I think might challenge on the front end. Miss and Sin, the European horse, may challenge her on the front end and push her a little bit. And so that could obviously change the dynamics quite a bit. I just think there's also a better caliber of horses running after her and chasing her this time around. And so it's hard for me to say, well, I'm fading in Italian. I know some people I talk to say in Italians, they're top single for the entire weekend. And I get it. And they go, this is the best bet of the weekend is in Italian. Maybe. Unlike Annapolis, who I kind of have come around on, in Italian, in this spot, it's going to be tough to just take them gate to wire at the Breeders' Cup. That's a tall, it's not impossible. It's been done before, but it's still a tall task for an Italian to do. So we'll see if she can do it, but that's going to be her modus operandi. That's what she's going to do. She is going to go to the lead and she is going to try to take this thing gate to wire. If she can, more power to her. It's just going to be tough, I think, because there's a higher caliber of horse chasing after her now. And I think there might be a little bit more pressure on the front end than what she's experienced at the First Lady and the Diana. So we have his final adult horse, which is Goodnight Olive. And Goodnight Olive is a horse that really fits a profile I like, which is a lightly raced horse with improving speed figures that is stepping up in class. And this is a horse that has had a lot of layoffs. You look at those running lines, ran first time out at Gulfstream in March of 2021, then promptly goes to the bench for 7 months, comes back in October of 2020, goes to the bench for well over a year at that point. Goes from March 2021 till October 2021. Oh, no, I'm getting all my dates confused here. So he goes to the bench for 7 months, comes back in Keeneland, breaks the maiden. Okay. Then goes out next month, wins an allowance race in pretty impressive fashion. Then goes to the bench again, this time until 2022, goes to the bench for another 7 months, comes back, wins an optional claimer 62, then comes back about a month and a half later, wins another optional claimer 80 for 3-time winners, and then steps up and runs at the Ballerina handicap and wins. And I mean, this is a brown horse that kind of came out of nowhere to some extent because of these long layoffs, because of these 7-month gaps, both between her first race and her second race, as well as between her third and fourth race. She kind of snuck up on the division in some ways. I mean, this is obviously an impeccably bred horse. You have Ghost Zapper up top. She's got a ton of speed. The concern in this particular race is that there's a lot of early speed. There's a lot of early speed in this filly. This is kind of the antithesis of the Breeders' Cup Sprint. The filly and mare sprint has a lot of early speed. So I actually kind of like a horse like Obligatory. That is more of a closer in this spot. Obligatory, of course, ran against her in the Ballerina, had a rough trip. I mean, Obligatory, if you go back and watch that race, got like body checked around the third and fourth turn, but still came on and ran a really good third. I just think Obligatory, the pace might set up pretty well for a horse like that. But Goodnight Olive is going to be part of that early speed, but doesn't need the lead. That's the nice part, is there is versatility here. So whoever ends up riding, if Irad ends up riding her, he's got some choices. He doesn't need to gun it and get to the lead. He can sit third, fourth, and then move. But there's going to be a lot of front end speed. And remember, this filly and mare sprint is 7 furlongs. So something to keep in mind. Now, granted, she's run that 7 furlongs before, but that's why I kind of like a horse like Obligatory, who runs those 1-turn miles occasionally, has that extra distance, has that extra stamina, can sit back and let the early speed go out and kind of wear itself out. But Goodnight Olive absolutely is a horse that, like I said, kind of surprised the Ballerina, but has to be taken seriously in the spot. So then you have his juveniles. You have a horse like Oxymor. It's a fascinating horse. If you look both up top and underneath, this horse has strong sprinter pedigree. That both the sire and the dam were turf sprinters, basically, and have largely produced turf sprinters. They've not had nearly as much success producing turf route winners, either of them, from the standpoint of their progeny and their offspring. So, I understand you have Medaglia d'Oro, an empire maker, kind of 2 generations back. So, there's distance can certainly be gotten there, but it is interesting that both the sire and dam were sprinters, and they've been producing largely turf sprinters. Now we're stretching this horse out. This horse kind of finished second at the now stakes. I just feel like Oxymor is kind of a cup below where some of these other juveniles are for the juvenile turf. But, you never want to count Chad Brown out in these spots. And this horse does have nice early tactical speed, which is important in order to getting your position in some of these races, making sure you're not being hung out too wide, making sure you get the right type of trip. So it would certainly give Jose Ortiz a lot of flexibility. But I think this horse may have some distance limitations that I am concerned about. Now, I'm Very Busy is another one of those turf horses going to the juvenile, the turf juvenile. And this is a horse that ran second in the Pilgrim. You see, made up a ton of ground late, over yielding ground. I mean, this horse has a devastating turn of foot. That yielding surface probably did not help. Finished second to Major Dude, but you look, this horse made up 5 lengths kind of in the snap of a finger, and was able to kind of put some pressure on Major Dude ultimately coming down the stretch, but wasn't able to get it done. Again, over yielding turf at that Belmont at Aqueduct meet. Now coming back, going to have much better footing this time around, and is a cloud computing horse, which is kind of interesting because that, of course, is a former horse that Chad Brown trained, and you wouldn't necessarily think that there's a ton of turf pedigree with cloud computing, but Chad has talked about this in interviews. This horse just loves the turf, and he said this is one where as soon as you put this horse on the turf, you knew this is where this horse belonged. The other thing to keep in mind is, as good as that turn of foot is, look at the buyer speed figures, 73, 73. Didn't show any progression and improvement from maiden to the Pilgrim. Again, the track conditions might have had an impact on that, but something to certainly keep in mind. So let's talk about Blazing Sevens, a horse that also has had to deal with some conditions and off-track issues. Last 2 times out have been sloppy sealed tracks at the Hopeful and at the Champagne. Did not run well at the Hopeful, finished way back, finished 12 lengths back in that particular race, but then comes back, bounces back, and wins the Champagne at a decent price with Flavian aboard, beating a horse like Verifying the Brad Cox horse, beating Gulfport, the Steve Asmussen horse. What do we do with Blazing Sevens? In this race, I'm kind of fading Blazing Sevens. I think a horse like Forte is better. I think the Baffert contingent of Cave Rock and National Treasure are both better. I just think there's a lot better horses in this race. So this is one where it's a good story. I like Blazing Sevens. That was a really nice effort on the Champagne, I thought, especially coming from off the pace to win that race, because coming from off the pace after getting, dirt and mud kicked up in your face is always something that actually really impresses me. But hard to see this horse tracking down and making the necessary speed figure jump. And that's the one thing is, you look at the Baffert horses. I mean, they're already cranking out 100, 104 buyer speed figures. I mean, this horse is going to have to make a jump. A horse like Forte, even though, ran a 92 last time, I'd expect Forte to be sitting on an even bigger race this time. So Blazing Sevens is going to have to progress. I'm just not sure this horse will progress. This horse will come running late. And if there is that aggressive pace up front, which I'm not sure there will be, because this is not a huge field, and it does feel like Cave Rock is the clear speed in this race. And if Cave Rock gets an easy lead, I mean, they're just going to be running a merry-go-round. I mean, this thing's they're not going to change a lot of positions, I don't think. So, that those kind of deep closers in some of these races where there's clear early speed, it's just a tough order. I remember last year there was a horse I really liked, Oviat Class. That's a horse that was a deep, deep closer. But, ultimately, if you just can get on the front end and get an easy lead, those deep closers don't have something to close into. And that's just, I think, a potential issue with Blazing Sevens. So we'll go to Free Look. And this is one that ran in the Miss Griot last time out, lost to Shug McGahee's horse, Pleasant Passage. But if you notice, Pleasant Passage, if you look at that running line for her, she had all ones in that running line. She went to the lead and just ran on the lead, gate to wire. If you look at the Free Look, ran second the whole way around, gate to wire. That was a true merry-go-round race. Nobody changed positions in that race. Everybody just stayed right where they were. Free Look kind of went up and tried to challenge Pleasant Passage, wasn't able to get past. Again, you can maybe make an excuse for the yielding turf. This is a very good, I like this horse a lot, but this feels like there's some other horses that might be in a little bit of a better spot here. I just feel like a horse like, G. Laurie or, some other horses that he's got in this. There are some other horses in this particular field that I just think are going to offer you a better price and may have better upside here. But certainly, Free Look showed a lot of potential. But like I said, the inability to get past a horse like Pleasant Passage, who's still in this field, was a little concerning that time. Like I said, there's some other horses, a horse like Grand Motion's G. Laurie, that I'm looking at in some of these other races. And then finally, Raging Sea. This is a really good horse. This is actually one of the horses I'm pretty high on. This Juvenile Fillies is a really wide open race. And it'll be interesting to see whether or not what sort of odds Raging Sea ends up getting, because she was very impressive at the Alcibiade, I thought, and ultimately did get DQ'd back to fourth, but was coming at the end, bumped into some of the other competition. I get the DQ; it was a legit DQ, that's fine, and a placement of fourth, but was really running. This is one where I'm totally fading Wagon Wheel, who was the winner of that Alcibiade. I'm looking at the horses that came in second and third. I'm looking at a horse like Chop Chop. I'm looking at a horse like Raging Sea. I like a horse like Atomically that's in this race. There's a lot of horses I like in this race. Chocolate Gelato, of course, will probably be the favorite, but I feel like Raging Sea is right there in the conversation, and I think needs to be taken seriously. This is a horse that can kind of carve out that mid-pack trip and can sit and is versatile, has a nice turn of foot when she decides to turn it on, even though, those time form speed figures would indicate that she's, has a little bit better speed early and maybe not as much speed late, but she closed nicely at the Alcibiade against Wagon Wheel. So that's one where I'm very high on this horse. Obviously a Curlin progeny. You have Stormcat influence underneath. I mean, there's a lot to like there for Raging Sea. I think you'll get a pretty nice price for her. And I know there's a lot of buzz about her already at the track and among a lot of people who are spectators already at Keeneland. So she's one that's absolutely a live shot. Well, that does it for our final barn tour. And this was our longest one by a mile. But then again, this was the most horses that we had to cover by a mile. So I hope you enjoyed these. This has been a lot of fun for me to do. Like I said, make sure to like and subscribe to Trust the Prophet so you can get all of the great content that we have coming up next week for the Breeders' Cup. We have more top 5 lists. We're going to be breaking down the Classic. We're going to be doing Capping the Card for the Friday races, where I give you my picks and my value plays for every single race. Going to do it again for the Saturday races, every single race, top pick and value play. Going to talk through each of those race shapes. It's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to have the fantasy draft. We're going to have special guests on from Horse Racing Nation, from overseas, from Twin Spires. We're going to have people from all over. So it's going to be great. You don't want to miss it. You want to make sure to like and subscribe. Follow me on Twitter at the handle @FailedToMenace to get all of that content. And finally, remember to go check out our partner and sponsor, PlayUp Racebook. And remember that if you deposit $250 today, you can receive a 50% deposit bonus for up to that $250 mark. Deposit $100 or more before the Breeders' Cup, and they will give you an additional $25 free wager. So make sure to go check out PlayUp Racebook. Well, listen, until next time, friends, my name is Matthew Desantis, wishing you a happy and prosperous day at the track, and reminding you that it's now post time.
Trust the Prophet's Breeders' Cup coverage is brought to you by PlayUp Racebook, the most horse player friendly racebook in the industry. PlayUp Racebook is always your best bet.